Hello chess friends and welcome to Yazadov's chess channel and welcome to the TCEC's 19 superfinal between the two top engines Leela C Zero and Stockfish. So we know that Stockfish will probably win the superfinal. It's not about that. It's not about follow this as a superfinal from this point of view. Who will win this? Stockfish is the winner of the superfinal, but I decided to show you more and more games because they were really incredible in some English opening lines, some King's Indian lines, some even Alekhine defense was played, so it was, I think, a great super final for us, and maybe in the next couple of seasons Leela C Zero can also improve and make maybe a better result against Stockfish. So let's check out now the game from the round 78. It was really incredible attack by Stockfish. As usual, we said round 1 and fight. So c4 played by the fish, c5 will come, of course, to the particular moment when the game is pre-arranged. So here knight to f6, knight to f3, d5, c takes d, knight to d5, and we have now e4. So this was all pre-arranged so far. Knight to b4, and we have bishop to c4, getting this bishop on this most active square, and now comes knight to d3. It seems maybe for most of us that something went wrong, but this is really a playable line. Here king to e2, knight to f4, king to f1, with ideas to castle by hand, sort of. Our main idea is to play something like h4, rook to h3, rook to g3, and secure the king here to g1. Because, okay, Black has weakened the pawn structure in front of the king a little bit, has also created this check, so white cannot castle in normal ways. But if you think about that more, you have played so many moves with your knight. Your knight is, of course, on a good square, but when we notice, white has at least developed 3 minor pieces, which is, of course, a huge advantage in development. So knight to e6, again a knight move, and we have now b4. This was also a pre-arranged line. The main idea is simply to deflect, like maybe in some Benko gambit lines, if you're familiar maybe with the Benko gambit, this very aggressive sideline of the Benoni. Then from Black's perspective, you're playing the Benko gambit, then you want to deflect this pawn, although you're giving up some material, but we want to grab really this pawn central control. That's the main that's the most important thing about this move. We have c takes b4 and now knight to e2, preventing some knight to d4 moves, because in some occasions Black could go into a simplified line with the idea knight to d4, knight takes d4. So that's why knight to e2 really kicks away this knight, and now again the same move with the knight, and finally we have d4. So e6, h4 was played, and now b5. So till this particular moment the game was prearranged, and what we can notice that, of course, first of all, after bishop to d3, of course, it was played by Stockfish, white has this dominant pawn central control. The d4 pawn is protected twice with the knight. The bishop is protecting, of course, the e4 pawn, and our main goal is to play h4, h6, e5, and really opening these 2 diagonals for the bishops. This is now really already a dangerous game. Black, of course, has the advantage on the queen side, because Black has a 3 versus 1 situation, so it's really a dynamic game. It was really a cool game, but you see now in a couple more moves that Black cannot make progress on the queen side so easily. Black cannot push just pawns. Black has to really regroup, because I think Black is really kicked away here too much by the minor pieces, by this pawn central control that white has built here. And as I said, although the king has played a couple moves, still this king is not endangered, as we can castle in a different way. King to g1, rook to h3, and rook to g3, which creates really this compact position in front of the king. So nothing went wrong, I think, here for white. So bishop to b7, we have this idea, rook to h3, a6, and now rook to g3. Okay, here knight to d7, of course a developing move, and now queen to e1. This idea is really a great one, but Stockfish, because we're placing the queen on the same file like the king, and now we want maybe to open the position, really, because Black has now several troubles to develop the bishop here, because when we see the g7 pawn is weakened, if you try, for instance, something like g6 immediately, we could proceed here with the move h5 and try to split the pawn structure in front of the king. And if you develop, for instance, the bishop on g7, then your b4 pawn is hanging, and if white manages to get his pawn back, then of course white is continuing the game with a better position, with this dominant position in the center, with the piece, with a better piece activity, with a great attacking formation. So that's why at least one way here for Black is to hang on to your extra pawn, sort of. So after the move queen to e1, rook to c8 was played, and we have now bishop to d2, simply attacking the pawn. And now this idea comes g6. If you try a5, that's also an idea. We could proceed, of course, and protect our pawn, but now rook to c1 will happen, again, a normal developing move, and after bishop to e7, you see you're simply losing the g-pawn, so that's why g6 would be sort of a fourth line, and as I said, our main tactical goal is here the move h5. Although you're giving up further material, but I'm not sure if black would ever capture the pawn, because now you see this is a pawn island, this is a pawn island. We have really weakened pawn structure in front of the king. All of these pawns are really clear targets, so that's why probably black would proceed with the normal bishop to g7, but now comes the tricky part. It's the move a3, which splits really the pawn structure. After b takes a3, we have bishop takes a5, and now both of these pawns are weaknesses because they're not connected. When you have two pawns like this, when they can move on freely, when they don't have any competition here on the B and A file, you want to connect them, but it's not so easy to connect these pawns because we can immediately take the pawn on bishop to b5 here, because the bishop creates this very annoying pin. We could also try bishop to b4, never allow black to castle here, and maybe take also out the a3 pawn. So as I said, very risky idea. So bishop to d2 was played. You see this a5 move, it's not so good, it's not bringing you so much. And here in the game, rook to d1 was played by a Stockfish. You see how compact really this setup of Stockfish is. It's really creating now really pressure on the d file, on the e file, on the g file. The bishops are aiming on the natural diagonals, the knights are centralized. At least they're protecting our center. So great setup so far. Knight to a8. We have now a monster move by Stockfish. Pause the video and try to find really the Stockfish move, as we always like to say. So test your might in chess. Try to find really a great attacking opportunity. Sort of, I would call it like this, because it's a great idea here by Stockfish. In this, let's try to play like Stockfish at least for a while. Okay. A good idea here, and it was a great really move by Stockfish. It's the move d5. Incredible stuff, because as I said, we have the powerful setup here on the e file and the d file and the g file. Of course, if something happens, we can use also this rook. So if you take, for instance, e takes d5, that's not a good choice, because you get simply e takes d5, and now our threat is simply knight to f4, followed with the discovered attack on the king. And if you try to cover, then knight to f4 will happen anyway, and after trades of queens, you see you cannot cover with the bishop. That's the main problem. Now d6 will happen, and you lose decisive material, so you would probably have to give up your battle on the e file. But now knight to g5, I think, wins the game here for white. So you see, I hope you could have seen this move. It was really a Stockfish move, great splitting pawns, opening breakthrough motif here by Stockfish. Really a dynamic move here, e5, locking really the center. But now, if you have noticed, we have a new strategical element, and it's a so-called supported pass pawn. So if this game goes into an endgame, if you could just imagine this position without minor pieces, without rooks, without queens on the board, then in the potential endgame, of course, black is one pawn up. What we can always take this pawn on b4. I think white is really a great position, because in an endgame, this supported pass pawn would be really a winning thematic thing that white has accomplished already in the game. So e5, we have bishop to b4, simply bishop takes b4, queen to b4, and now knight to b6, and now queen to d2. What our idea is, of course, to occupy here the dark squares. In the game, f6 was played, and now comes this idea, as I said, h5, knight to c5, attacking the bishop. And here Stockfish played king to g1, which was maybe unnecessary. Okay, here queen to h6 is also a great idea, because it doesn't matter if we lose this bishop on d3, we'll simply recapture on d3, and our bishop is blocked by our own pawn structure anyway, so it's basically a bad bishop. Although this bishop is controlling the c4 square, but we cannot simply use them as an attacking piece. We would have to make maybe an f4 move in order to just make these pawns rolling. So that's why here it's not it's also a good idea. I think this idea, queen to h6, after king to d7, we could simply play here queen to g7, and maybe play rook to g6, getting also some extra material. And now this rook will come very active into the game, and I think white has a comfortable game from this point on. But okay, rook to g1, also an interesting idea. We have rook to c7, and now comes really an incredible Stockfish move d6, sacrificing our supported pass pawn. Incredible stuff. And what to do here? If you take, for instance, queen to h6, queen takes d6, then you get bishop to b5, the discovered attack on the queen with the check, and it's game over. So that's why here Leela C Zero played rook to c7, but now rook to c6, pardon me, and now we have knight to h4, simply attacking the pawn here on g6 further. Again, if you try g takes h5, then again you're creating more and more weaknesses in the game. Here g5 was played, but now we have d7 attacking the king, and now queen to d7, and now knight to f5. This d7 in between move, I think, was very important, because it deflects a little bit the queen here on d7, and now we could use the square f5, and you'll need at least 2 more moves in order to attack the knight. So you have to play again somewhere with your queen, and then you have to play with the bishop on c8, and you all know that Stockfish is simply the great player of tempos, so that's why Stockfish saw here that the queen is not so good here placed on d7. Now our knight on f5 is really the so-called octopus knight. It's really controlling the center of the board. We have a great rook and queen battery on the d file, and now we can also try maybe to improve the position here with the potential h6, which creates also some damage in black's position. So castling, we have queen to b4, queen to c7, and now bishop to c2, getting out finally with the bishop here of this attack. We are trying now to play bishop to b3, getting use of this long diagonal. Here king to h8 was played, and now bishop to b3. We have bishop to c8, and now h6. Great move by Stockfish, really creating a very nice checkmate pattern that will play an important role now in the continuation of the game, because this h6 cuts off a potential escape by the king on g7. So there are always this back rank tactical problems on the d file. For instance, it's not going to happen immediately, but as a long-term plan, you see the rooks are a little bit out of game. They're not connected. You should really keep your rooks connected. So that's why after potential rook to d3 idea, so far it's not possible, as I said, but here back rank problems here with the potential check on the 8th rank, and you see there are, as I said, always this checkmate threats, but we'll come to that part in the continuation of the game. So bishop to f5, I think Leela C Zero, if an engine could be happy, then Leela C Zero was probably happy because it finally got rid of this very annoying knight on f5. We have e takes f5, and now rook to d8. Rook takes d8, queen to d8, and now rook to c3. As I said, we had a little bit of lack of connection between all of these rooks in the game. So now rook to c3 comes very actively into the game, and we have now created a dangerous spin. Here you cannot move the knight, and because you lose simply the rook. So rook to queen to d6 was played. If you try, for instance, something like knight to d3 in order to kick away the queen, then you see rook takes d3 is a possibility, and that's what I meant. Your queen to f8 is a checkmate. So that's always that you have to worry about in the game. Queen to d6 was played, and now a3. In the game, knight to c8 was played. Here in the game, a4 played by Stockfish. Instead of this knight to c8, if you try, for instance, knight to b3, then you see it gets really dangerous, because we can play rook takes c6, and after something like queen to c6, again the same idea here. Queen to f8, it's checkmate. If you try to take the queen, it's not a problem. We can simply take, and we continue now the game up the exchange. We can grab this pawn afterwards. We can grab also this pawn. It's a completely winning game here for white. So after the move a3, as I said, knight to c8 was played, and now a4. That's the move that really creates now enormous pressure against black. Again, if you try knight to b3, it's not a problem. We can play simply rook takes c6, because after queen to b4, we can take rook takes c8, and again you can only cover with the queen. Again, it's very nice checkmate pattern on the back rank. So after the move a4, we have a knight to e7, and now a takes b4, a takes b5, a takes b5, and now queen to b5, knight takes f5. Here Stockfish loses a pawn, but it's not a problem, because bishop to c2, that was Stockfish's main goal. Again, continuing with our really great pin here on the c file, and now this bishop gets very active. There are now new tactical threats. Although Leela C Zero solved maybe some other threats, now there are new threats. This is the way how Stockfish performs. Bishop to c2, knight takes h6, but now knight to g3. We want to play the very annoying knight to e4 move, creating a further pin on this overloaded knight on c5. So f5, we have bishop takes f5, knight to g8. Here, as I said, if you try something like king to g7 in order to escape with your king, then knight to e4 wins the game immediately. That's not an option here for black. So as I said, f5, knight, bishop to f5, and here knight to g8 was played. Bishop to h3, and now knight to e7. Bishop to g4, we have e4, and now we have rook to a3. The idea is again to create this very annoying check on the back rank. So knight to a6, we have queen to b2. There are now also some dark square problems to protect. Queen to f6. Leela C Zero would love probably to simplify the game by trades of queens, but not an option here for Stockfish. Queen to e2, the king is simply too much endangered. You could try maybe here a check, but it's not a problem. We can simply play here with the king, and after something like queen to h6, we could try knight to f5, and again we would have a new piece which controls again here the g7. Your knight is hanging, you have to move somewhere with the knight. There are also this ideas to play queen to b2, so this rook to c1 is okay. It's of course one tempo against the king, but in long terms it doesn't help you out anyhow. So after the move queen to e2, we have queen to d6, we have rook to a1, knight to g8, and now queen takes e4, getting back some material. But now still this king is endangered on the h8. It's really cornered. The queen is only used as a defensive piece. The queen is only protecting here this long diagonal, this dark square problems in front of the king. Knight to f6 was played, and now we have queen to a4, queen to e5, and now rook to d1, rook to c7, and now queen to b3, king to g7. You could also try maybe knight to g4, but that's the main tactical threat here is again rook to d8. Again, this backtrack problems, and after king to g7 now comes the stunner. Rook takes g8. It's really a forced winning move here for white, although black is one piece up, but the activity of white's pieces is simply too much to handle here for black. You could try king to h6 to escape, but now comes the stunner. Knight to f5. It's a checkmate after queen to f5. Queen to h3. You see this tactic. In this particular case, you could also try king to f6, but now again queen to f3. After king to e7, we could grab simply back our piece, and now again the king is too endangered. If you try rook to c1, it's not a problem. If you try, for instance, to regroup, then queen to c8 will happen again. We'll have some tactical threats here on the e file. The knight is very active. We can also create a check with the knight, so it's a completely winning endgame here for white. So after the move queen to b3, you saw the tactical problems. You cannot take the bishop on g4. King to g7 was played. Knight to f5, king to g6, and now knight to e3. Knight to c5, attacking the queen, but again the queen comes behind here. Very important attack. We want, of course, to attack the king maybe from the square g8. So far it's not possible because the knight is a good defensive bit, but as a long-term attack it could also work. So king to g7, knight to f5 again, king to g6, and now knight to d6, cutting off the connection between the queen and the rook. So the rook has to move, rook to e7, but now bishop to f5. You see how Stockfish uses this activity of the pieces. King to g7, bishop to b1, and now knight to g8. Knight to f5 again, the fork, and here queen to f8. You could also take out. Oh, pardon me, it's not the possibility. The queen is hanging. Sorry about that. I didn't see that. So you cannot take the rook. Sorry about that. Here queen to f8 was played. Now the rook is hanging, and now knight to e6. We have queen to a1, queen to a8, escaping with the queen. Rook to c7, and now queen to e8 again. Now g4, but now bishop to a2. Very important attack. As I said, the king is attacked on light squares, has also some dark square problems. It's really that here in this particular case, black is only defending. Black is not using any counter attacks. It's simply as that. Here again, queen to f5, but now after bishop to e6, this bishop comes now very actively into the game. Queen to g6. Queen takes g6, which was really a surprise, but after h takes g6, now comes rook to d8, g3 was played, and after f takes g3, in this position, Leela C Zero resigned. So why did Leela C Zero resign? But because there is now the continuation. You have to first of all play the move rook to g7, but now g4 will happen, and you see now we have sort of a Zugzwang position where black cannot escape with the rook, black cannot escape with the knight. So the only piece that black can move is the king, and after something like king to h7, we would simply further push our pawn on g5, and again the pieces are simply paralyzed. And the problem is now, if you try for instance something like knight to e7, we will use simply rook to d3, and we will play rook to h3. So you would be forced something to play king to h8, but now rook to f3. We're cutting off really this connection, and black has troubles, as I said, to really activate these pieces. Rook to f8 is a threat, rook to h3 is also a threat. If knight to f5, we could also maybe take bishop takes a5, rook to f5, and continuing the game with two pass pawns here, which could be also winning endgame. But as I said, here, if you try, for instance, after move g4, you can try g5, but here bishop to a2 was simply staying on this diagonal. And if you try, for instance, to escape with the king, we're simply moving up our king, and now bishop to b1. You can never escape with the king. That's the main problem. You would have again to cover with your knight on h7, and now the king can simply march on, and we are getting simply after this pawn. If we grab this pawn, it's of course a completely winning endgame. Here after bishop rook to e7, we could try bishop to e4, still continuing the game. If the king is too far away from the defense of the g5 pawn, then of course it's again winning here for white. The problem is now that you cannot even play king to g7, because we'll simply take rook takes h7. So incredible endgame here that Stockfish realized that it's winning. Leela C Zero again lost the game. As I said, this super final is simple over. Leela C Zero cannot catch this up anymore. Stockfish is the new god in chess. Stockfish is unbeatable basically, and it performed really great in this TCEC Season 19 super final. I hope that you enjoyed this game. I think it was really incredible game in a very tricky line with this b4 idea, deflecting the pawn from the center, getting the pawn central control, getting our h4 h5 attack, activating the bishops, getting our pawn back, then really try to hang on to our pawn central control, creating the supported pass pawn, sacrificing the supported pass pawn for the initiative, creating really some madness, and this is this great Stockfish style. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game like I did. If you want to see more games from this TCEC Season 19 super final and some more great top engine games, here is the link. And if you want to see humans battling in their best chess games, check out my best chess games of all time series. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.